Look at the way Anthony Albanese is behaving. He's not responding as if he really cares much about the voters.
Posey Parker, who has been attacked both verbally and physically by transgender activists.
Look, the bottom line is this is the final kick in the guts for most of us.
Welcome to our last official episode of the Aussie Wire News for 2023. Beginning next week, we will commence a 2-week series of specials, still being released at the same times at 4 p.m, every Tuesday and Thursday. And in those specials, we're giving you some of our favourite interviews and the absolute highlights from the last 8 months since the Aussie Wire was created. That's right, it's only been 8 months since we launched, and in that time, so much good stuff has happened. Now, during this 2-week special period, the team will be taking a much-needed break for a few weeks to recharge and to recalibrate for 2024. And listen, I'll be talking to you about 2024 when we get there, but rest assured, the Aussie Wire is growing. By mid-2024, you'll see new shows, new presenters, and the Aussie Wire will no longer just be a bi-weekly news channel. It will be much, much more. More on that next year. For today, please enjoy the news. Well, no doubt you saw the news. Who could possibly have missed it? That the COP28 conference in Dubai went ahead. Of course, that's one of those big climate talk fests that happens from time to time. And there was big news, a huge result, something that was truly momentous and world-changing. And this being the case, of course, well, we're going to talk about it here on the Aussie Wire, aren't we? This momentous, world-changing event, this agreement that's been reached. And who else would I bring on to discuss this with me other than our science correspondent, Joanne Nova? Thank you so much for joining us once again here on the Aussie Wire.
Topher, thank you, because of course this was historic. It was landmark, it was unprecedented, and it was, to use the actual phrase, transition away from fossil fuels for the first time ever in human history with one of these COP, Conference of Parties events. Well, you know, be still my beating heart, as I said on the blog. It's just one non-stop propaganda issue. And remember, these events have happened for 28 years in a row, and they're 2 weeks long. And this was a monster of a huge event. And we're talking Olympic level kind of conference. When I went to Bali for the UNFCCC in 2007, there were 13,000 people there.
Wow.
This time, they estimate 70,000 to 90,000 people in Dubai. Can you imagine 70,000 for 2 weeks or 90,000 for 2 weeks?
And well, the good news is, though, they all paid for trees to get planted to offset all of the jet fuel they used getting there. Now, this is the obligatory opening photo with various world leaders and delegates. But Joe, tell me, I read these headlines that told me that this was a failure. It was at risk of failure. This is only a day before the conference wound up. I lost sleep that night. I couldn't sleep. I thought, oh no, if the COP28 conference fails, what could that possibly mean for me? What was going on there?
Well, that was the same routine they play each time. It's all one global theatre. Every year, it's a struggle. They almost don't get there. And there are debates and there are small parties that disagree and furious this and that. And they stay up all night and hammer out something remarkable. It's always historic and it's always unprecedented. And it always happens at 3 a.m. on the last possible day that it could happen, because that makes the best headlines and the best drama. And that's what this is about. Think of it as Broadway theatre, not as a conference of world leaders, although it was.
Excuse me. As entertaining as it is to watch this theatre play out, I want to bring us back down to earth with a little bit of reality, which is something that you do so well in your blogs, Joe. Talk me through this, excuse me, I've just breathed the wrong way, this graph here from your blog.
Well, after all these 28 years of Global Conference of Parties meeting, I think there were 140 global leaders present at this event, nearly everyone except President Xi and President Biden turned up. Despite all of these meetings and all of these agreements, we're looking at the global primary energy consumption, and we are a fossil-fueled world. In fact, it's been a transition to fossil fuels the whole of the last century. And you look at the enormous amount of coal, oil and gas that basically drives our civilization and made it possible for 8 billion people to enjoy being alive. I mean, the renewables revolution, the entire renewables transition is visible there in black at the top. It's nothing. And so it's all fakery, again, designed to make us think that renewables are a inevitable thing. If you imagine these giant UN COP meetings as simply an advertising campaign for the renewables industry and all the investors in renewables, it kind of all makes sense. They're behaving exactly as if that was their main job.
What's striking about this graph, and something that I hadn't fully appreciated until I think it was a couple of years ago reading one of your blogs, was, of course, there's the saying, there's lies, there's damned lies, and there's statistics. What they love to do with renewable energy is talk about the percentage. Oh, renewable energy increased as a percentage, up to this percentage. What they're not telling you is that the overall amount of energy consumption and therefore production is growing so fast that despite the percentage of renewables increasing, the absolute amount of fossil fuels being burned is going up by astonishing amounts. And correct me if I'm wrong, that remains true to this day.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just this week we found out that 2023 coal use around the world was the highest ever since Homo sapiens started using coal. So it's hit yet another record. It was 8.5 billion tonnes of coal burned in 2023. And, despite all the lies, coal is not going anywhere. And when we look at that graph, the fossil fuel graph, what we can see is even in our civilization where we might brag, oh, we're now blah, blah percent renewable, we're not. We're buying all these products from China. And what's China using to make all these products? It's using the same coal that we used to use to make these products, but we just ship the factories off to China, and now we're buying back effectively the fossil fuel power via China. So nothing has really changed. The renewable energy is just the icing on the top of the cake, so to speak.
But Joe, this has to be fake news. This can't be true, because the 28 in the 28 in COP28 means that they've done this 28 times now, and obviously every single time they've come away with these momentous, unprecedented, world-changing agreements. This is the 28th time they've come away with these world-changing agreements. Surely fossil fuel usage couldn't possibly be hitting peak and record levels now after all the hard work they've done over those decades. What's wrong with the picture here?
People think that they've got some democratic control over what's going on. And you look at the way Anthony Albanese is behaving, he's not responding as if he really cares much about the voters. I mean, a little bit. I'm glad to see there is still, a little bit of concern there. But most of these decisions appear to be made, oblivious to what the voters want. Because when we survey the voters, when we have a real debate, we have seen time and time again that the voters say, well, actually, no, we don't really care that much about. We don't really believe the UN scientists and the lab coats. And I'm talking about surveys that show 50 to 60% of the public essentially saying, well, I'm really not sure that solar panels do stop floods in Bangladesh, and that if we cancel all our coal plants, it will revive the Great Barrier Reef. People are not buying that kind of extensive link. They just say yes when a surveyor comes, because it's a lot easier than the pain of saying, no, I'm a climate denier. And
having to tolerate all of the hate that comes along with that. It's just extraordinary, the multiple layers of theatre here. The theatre on the political side, as you've just pointed out, where they make promises and tell us certain things that they know aren't true, in my opinion. That's my opinion of what's going on. The theatre that goes on at a global level, 70,000 people flying around the globe, maybe more, in order to tell us that they're saving the planet. But I thought their choice of venue this time was particularly appropriate, because Dubai, of course, is one of those places in the world that is not known for excess and crazy technological feats and energy consumption. No, of course not. I mean, these are people that live in harmony with nature. You won't see a single light bulb turned on that doesn't need to be turned on. You won't see lavish cars and private planes in a place like that. They're living very much in harmony with nature. And of course, they would never do something as environmentally irresponsible as create an indoor snow park, complete with penguins, by the way, in one of the hottest climates on Earth. At what point does this become so absurd that it all comes crashing down?
Well, I think it is coming crashing down, and we're seeing that at least in terms of the money and the investments. where the third quarterly reports that came out for wind and solar in the end of October, beginning of November were shocking. I mean, solar, some of those companies, some of the biggest solar producing companies have gone down 70% this year in the stock value. Wind down 30% to 40%. Across the board, sustainable funds are being hit. So, have a look at where your super is and make sure your super is not invested, because as interest rates have gone up, it has really hurt those industries which really aren't that profitable.
Yeah.
And in this case, the renewable industries are struggling this year because those interest rates have gone up, and suddenly everyone is saying, well, no thanks, and cancelling the orders for next year. The EV orders were also down and EV stocks were also being hurt. So, watch behind the scenes, because what we're seeing, the reality is that countries, as we saw in the Ukraine, Russia, in the bad part of the war, everyone said, oh, this will be the new beginning, the new wonderful time of renewable energy, because everyone will find out how much they don't need the coal, as coal and oil. Remember, they all got so expensive as the gas went up in price. And yet, despite the incredible expense of all of those things, you know what? Everyone bought more coal, more oil, and more gas than ever, and not more renewables. So renewables got tested, I would say, last year, and everyone kind of realised, well, hang on, the emperor has no clothes.
Well, I said at the end of 2022 that in my view, 2023 was going to be the year when the pushback began in earnest. And I think that's been true on the cultural front in a very big way, but I think it's also proving to be true in a less distinct way, but proving to be true on these sorts of debates as well. I do think that reality is filtering through more and more, and that's thanks in part to the tireless work of yourself, Joe, and so many others that have been chipping away at this. How long have you been chipping away at this for now, Joe?
Well, that UN conference in December 2007 was my first kind of intense exposure. And boy, was it fun. And we played a game of tag with the UN constantly throughout that, where they would cancel venues at the last minute. And, it's always plausible deniability. Forget to put our venues announcements on the letterboard so people didn't know where we were. And it was that kind of game the whole time. And I noticed that happened with the Pacific Islanders. The poor Pacific Islanders need to wake up, because they're being used as the, token mascots. Yeah. And they, of course, were wheeled out for the media to say, oh, look, these people, going to lose their homes, and it will be such tragedy when the sea washes in. Of course, we've seen studies showing that 89% of these Pacific Islands are growing in size. They're not shrinking at all. So it's all a myth. And then at the last minute, Topher, you would not believe, those poor Pacific Islanders, the mascots, were somehow arranged to be out of the room having a meeting when the final historic, landmark, unprecedented vote came through. And they were all away from the room to come back in and find that this watered down nothingness kind of deal had been agreed. And wouldn't it have been inconvenient if they had been in the room and they had have said, but wait a minute, this is going to do nothing. And so one of the Pacific Islanders stood up, representative, and said, well, actually, we've been not very ambitious, and this is not really much of an achievement. And they stood up and gave them a 2-minute standing ovation for that. I mean, is there any better example of what a theatre the whole thing is? 2 minutes for saying, actually, we achieved nothing.
Yeah. You've just pointed out how useless we all are. Yay, we'll applaud you for 2 minutes straight for doing that. It's just amazing. It's just right there in plain sight for anyone willing to see it. It's quite incredible.
And they knew they'd been shafted, because they said, why is everyone applauding?
Yeah.
It's just the joke. Everyone was applauding because they felt sorry for the Pacific Islanders, because they had just shafted them and made the decision without them, knowing that they might not agree to a global nothingness deal, which could still be called historic, unprecedented, and landmark deal.
Well,
that's the headline they wanted.
That's the saying, if you lie down with dogs, you wake up with fleas. And unfortunately, there's a whole lot of dogs have gotten into bed together, and some of them are discovering that they're waking up with fleas. Joanne Nova.
That's the UN for you.
That is the UN, absolutely. And we're finding the same thing, and our governments are finding the same thing as well. But Joanne Nova, that's a story for another time, and perhaps even for another year. Thank you so much for being a core part of the Aussie Wire this year. We look forward to having you on again next year.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Well, some say there is a war on men. Some say there isn't. Some say there is, but it's a good thing, because we need to take those pesky men down a peg, and perhaps the world would be a better place if they took a back seat for a while and let the women rule the world, as a popular pop song would have you believe they already do, or run the world, excuse me. So, A filmmaker in the UK decided to find out, well, what are men good for? And she created the documentary titled The Abolition of Men. Her name is Jess Gill. She joins me right now here on the Aussie Wire. Jess, thank you so much for making time to come and chat with us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute honour.
Now, I've got a clip here. I want to open with this because it's quite a gobsmacking thing. This is from early on in your documentary. It's a fabulous documentary. We'll put the link in the description of this video. But here is a clip.
What are women good for?
Everything.
Everything. What are men good for?
Nothing.
Do you think men are important in society?
Well, I guess
It's just painful.
I guess what traditionally defines men, you know, the traditionally masculine areas of what people do. I think some of that may be important in society, but I think it's probably been overly prioritized in society. Like, the masculine way of dealing with things is often more aggressive and more kind of, you know,
Do you think it's a bad thing?
I think it often is a bad thing. I think it can be a bad thing, and I think probably we need less of it. We need a somewhat more traditionally feminine approach to quite a lot of the problems we have in the world.
Wow, I'm really impressed that you kept your composure. That stuff frustrates me so much. Anyway, putting that aside, what was the inspiration for you to even be walking out there and asking these questions?
I thought it was just a generally interesting question, what are men good for? With my Vox Pop style questions, I do them quite frequently on the street in like more liberal areas like Shoreditch in London. And my tactic isn't really to like debate them. I want them to like dig their own graves. And if you just ask them the basic questions, because they have this idea of what to say in their head, which sounds good, but when they actually say it out loud, when they can't say, what are men good for? Men are good for a lot of things. Men are good for being protectors, being providers, building our entire society. When they can't say that, it says a lot about society. Or even saying, are men good? Like, if a man can't justify his own self-worth, like, I think it says a lot about society.
Well, that's what I find astonishing about that particular response that you captured there. Now, you were telling me off air that actually went viral, and that became the catalyst for why you even made this documentary in the first place. So it's an awful lot of work to make a documentary. I know that firsthand. It's often unrewarding in the sense that you put it out there into the world and a certain number of people see it, and then you kind of go, oh, okay, well, now what? What's the experience been like for you, and what's the reception been like to the work that you've created?
So this is actually my second documentary. Okay. It's completely me doing it pretty much. With Reason supports, like with equipment and also a filming person. Reason UK is the organisation that I make these videos with. Yeah. And the first one was actually about the gender critical movement in the UK. So, you know, Posey Parker, who has been attacked both verbally and physically by transgender activists. And in my first documentary, it was to expose the atrocities that these activists have been doing. And these are people who are seen as being on the right side of history by the media. They're constantly defended by the media. And I wanted to change that narrative because it was truly awful. These are just middle-aged women, you know, they're mums, they're sometimes lesbians, who just simply want their spaces and their daughters' spaces to be protected. Yeah. And you have these fully grown men attacking them, going up to these protests and basically slandering them. And it was the same kind of thing with the Abolition of Men documentary, in the sense that I wanted to expose this really awful narrative, and I'm not sure where exactly it's come from, because I don't believe it was really inspired by like the Me Too movement. I think it was more underlying than that. I think in the effort to empower women, we've at the same time sort of got rid of the importance of men. Men are just simply, as Connor Tomlinson from the podcast Lolicato said in the documentary, they're simply castrated women, pretty much. And that's such an awful thing in society. I think my approach with these documentaries is to expose, is to go against the idea that facts don't care about your feelings. Facts are, of course, important, I think, and a lot of our discourse is surrounded by facts. Of course, our experiences are shaped by facts, and I think as conservatives, we're a lot more fact-based than leftists. But we need to show how these things impact people. It's deeply saddening when a man can't say that he's important.
We do have a bit of a backlash happening at the moment, though, and we see that being expressed in some ways that are healthy, with many men and indeed many women returning to a sense of traditional masculinity and the desire to form families, which is the most basic unit of society, etc. But we also see it expressed, and this is my opinion here, in some unhealthy ways, with some men going for a genuinely aggressive form of hypermasculinity, a sense of dominance, and seeing that is the correct expression of masculinity. How is it that men in, let's take the UK where you're based, the young men that you see around you that are searching for meaning, that are searching for what is their role in a society that has widely rejected that there is such a thing as a role for them in society, how would they possibly be able to find their way?
I think it's incredibly tough for young men in particular because of multiple factors. Like, I think university has had a massive impact because basically, it's like Lord of the Flies. They're allowed to do whatever they want. They're allowed to sleep around. They're allowed to get drunk all the time. And all they have to do in return is complete a university essay every few weeks. And because of that, there's these perverse incentives that encourages this hedonistic lifestyle. And then on top of that, the sexual revolution is a massive thing. The sexual revolution has tricked women into believing that sleeping around is empowering, that it's something natural that everyone should do, that it's just a part of the university experience, and it's discouraging this sort of nuclear family idea that we want to promote. I know multiple people who went to university, and because they went to university, they broke up with their girlfriends. In an alternate universe where Tony Blair didn't encourage so many people to go to university, these people would have probably stayed with their partner, got married, and had kids already. I think because of the push for university, because of the push for short-term relationships, to sleep around, this has encouraged men and women to go through this sort of sleeping around lifestyle, and that doesn't come with responsibility. I think something understated that we don't discuss enough is, obviously, women are impacted by hookup culture. That is oftentimes discussed because women feel used. But I don't think we talk about men being impacted by hookup culture and having short-term relationships. I think men need this sense of responsibility, and they need a sense of purpose. I think that's actually why the male suicide rate is so high, because men who have lost everything, they feel like that's the only solution. And in response to that, they're told to just talk it out, have a beer with their mates at the pub. That's not really a solution. That's a very feminine solution, not addressing the issue. And so you wonder why so many young men are going to people like Andrew Tate, who I'd admit has some good advice. Like, when I see him on my Instagram, he's a lot more different to how he's depicted in the mainstream media. For valid reasons and some unvalid reasons. The majority of the advice that he's given to young men isn't the awful advice that the media is depicting it as. Of course, I'm not saying he's not giving that advice. I'm saying the more mainstream advice that he's giving, the mainstream things that he's saying in these TikTok, Instagram reels, isn't just have sex with a load of women all the time. It's be a provider, be a protector, and I think that resonates with a lot of men, and he's taken up the role of someone like Jordan Peterson. I think men are craving some sort of fatherly figure, some sort of guidance, because our education system really doesn't push them. Society, again, if you ask what are men good for, they don't know. In all sorts of institutions, like the RAF, for example, in the UK, they discouraged white men from attending. The RAF, the army, is a core thing for men to go into. It's one of the main ways they can get purpose, and by these woke diversity quotas, they're discouraging that.
Well, Andrew Tate's not someone that I particularly like to talk about, because I think he's been lionised for let me just say, I think there's a lot of things in his past that he's not being held accountable for at the moment, and I'll let the courts do that in Europe, and also people make their own judgments about some of what he's said in the past that remains unaddressed. I'm all for forgiveness, I'm all for second chances, I'm all for people learning, but I don't believe he's learnt from some of his worst mistakes. Having said that, you're absolutely right. When you do see a reel come across your feed and you just see that selected little bit of content, it is just direct advice that is actually oftentimes good advice to men, and something that is sorely lacking. So, Jess, take us out here with answering your own question. What are men good for?
I think, obviously, I like how you did the Uno reverse card there. That's quite funny. I think men are good for a lot of things. I think men and women are good for a lot of things. I think we need to define that oftentimes they're good for separate things. I think women are a lot more compassionate. I think men are a lot more, or at least should be a lot more stoic. I think in the way they treat things, it's a sense of responsibility. You know, they really thrive on responsibility. I think look around you, most of the things built in your house, on your street, in the world have been built by men. I think there's been a lot of good leaders who are men, and I don't think, we necessarily need, I'm not saying we shouldn't have female leaders, but I think there have been so many strong leaders who are men and are good representatives of men, like Winston Churchill. Maybe not the current politicians, I don't think they're good examples, but in the traditional sense, definitely. And I think because of that lack of heroicism, the positive traits that men have just been sort of turned around. Like I said, they don't have that responsibility. And if you want to talk about toxic masculinity has come about because of this denial of masculinity. It's a good thing that men want to hold doors open for women. I think that should be an honourable thing, or that men want to pay for the dates. I think that should be something promoted, quite frankly. And because of that, because men aren't seen to be protecting women, when a woman comes forward being like, hey, this guy's done this awful thing to me, if he's been disrespectful to me, I think a lot of men don't have that protective aspect in the same way anymore. So it really comes back to women as well. Women need strong men. I think society needs strong men, and strong men need society to promote them.
Well, Jess Gill, thank you so much for making The Abolition of Men. We will put the link to your documentary in the description of this video so people can watch it for themselves. I do highly recommend it. It is illuminating, if at times, as you saw my reaction there, that clip that we showed, it is infuriating to watch how some people simply cannot or will not answer such a simple, straightforward question. But Jess Gill, thank you so much for making the doco and highlighting this issue, and thank you for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Thank you.
Well, this is the last official episode of the news for this year, and it was really important to me to make sure that we covered a topic, or touched once again on a topic that is particularly close to my heart. I first began talking about water and water supply issues in the southeast of Australia way back in 2009. Yes, coming on 15 years ago, and it was in fact the very first issue that I tackled, and the one that kind of made me who I am today, all these years later. But unfortunately, despite 15 years of coverage of this issue, things have only gotten worse and not better. I'm talking, of course, about the recent decision by the federal government to continue with water buybacks in the Murray Darling Basin, another 450 gigalitres, which if you're from the city and you don't know what a gigalitre is, it's just a crap load of water. And 450 gigalitres out of a system that is already strained from farmers and irrigators that have already had an enormous amount of water taken off them is just absolute madness, in my opinion. And I'm not alone. I'm joined by John Lolicato. Now, John, you are an irrigator. You're in the New South Wales region. How is this announcement? It's not a recent announcement anymore. It was a month or so ago. But what's the mood? What's the vibe in your irrigation communities around this?
Oh, it's actually devastating. With that announcement the other day, we've communities, irrigation communities, townspeople, the whole lot, for 12 years, we've actually bent over backwards to work with government since the implementation of the Basin Plan, which started in 2012. They've asked us to attend meetings, they've asked us to do submissions, they've asked us to do all sorts of stuff, and it's all been on deaf ears, completely on deaf ears. We actually thought we were gaining a little bit of ground at one stage, but with Plibersek's announcement just recently about restoring rivers, even the actual wording of restoring rivers is wrong, because I'm quite proud of our rivers. I think our rivers are actually in pretty good shape after 200 years of white settlement. We've planned for the future. Our forefathers did an exceptionally good job. We live in the driest inhabited continent in the world. We needed to take some of the variability out of the system. So our forefathers built the Snowy Mountain scheme, dams up in the hills. Okay, there were some consequences, but at the same time, our whole system has actually revolved around it. Plus, we've allowed, communities to develop inland, which was the problem originally. Everyone wanted to settle along the coast. With the development of inland, put water in a dry, arid climate, and you'll get people that will follow. They'll grow food and they'll grow fibre, and that's what we have been doing. We've been trying to get this government to realise that you can't just keep on, milking a stone, because it's we've already given up. There's over 4,000 GL, 400,000 megs of water that has already been taken out of productive communities and been put into an environmental bucket. And, they keep talking about 2,100 GL and all the rest of it. If you look up the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holders, the amount of environmental water that is actually owned by the environment, not just the Commonwealth, but also the state, there's over 4,000 GL, which is Dartmouth Dam is 4,000 GL, or 4 million megs.
There's a lot of people who'd be watching there from the city, or even if they're from the country, they're not irrigators. They wouldn't really necessarily understand what it is that we're discussing here. It's worth talking a little bit about what the river was before the dams and the weirs and the regulation was put in. It's a historical fact, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Murray River used to actually run completely dry, and we have photographs from the early 1900s of exactly that happening. So let's talk for a minute, if you would, about the environmental benefits that have actually come as a result of things like dams and weirs and even the irrigation.
Well, as I said before, the Australia is well renowned as the driest inhabited continent of the world. Now, when you're that dry, you've got river systems that like flooding, rains and drought. It's just part of a sequence. So that's why it was so important to actually try to take some of the variability out of the river systems that we've got, and that's where building the dams was so important. And also, when they were first, Australia's a huge continent. Everyone wants to live on the coast. How do you encourage people inland? You encourage people inland by creating opportunities, and that's what our forefathers did by building the dams. That's allowed us to actually, we've got river communities all the way up and down the river. Previously, the Murray River, without the dams, the Murray River would have run dry at least 8 to 9 times, completely dry. So the towns like Adelaide, that isn't even in the basin, by the way, towns like Adelaide, Albury, all of the towns along the river, they would have completely run out of water. Ever since the dams have been built, 1936 for Hume Dam, the river has never run dry since. And that's something that everyone tends to forget about. And what it's done, it's created a huge opportunity for Australia to actually be the food bowl the food bowl of Australia, but we actually, most of our produce is exported, which we carry a huge burden for Australia.
So we'll get to the produce that's produced in a moment. I want to stick with the environmental aspects of this, something that I hadn't really considered until I began to actually cover this topic and really research it and get out onto farms and see it for myself. I've got a photograph here of yourself. This is you looking spiffy, looking fine there on a beautiful sunny day. You've got a couple of working dogs with you, and behind you is actually a rice crop. Now, I don't have audio for this, but I can tell you what it sounded like, because I've been to these sorts of places before, and certainly by nightfall, you would have heard nothing but the deafening roar of cicadas, frogs croaking relentlessly. I'll warrant there were some fish in the channels that fed that particular crop, and by day you would have had migrating birds wandering through the water, picking out bugs and various things. Am I wrong?
Look, you've hit it right on the head there. With that's a rice crop that you're seeing in the background, and the thing with rice, okay, a lot of people say that we shouldn't be growing it in Australia. Rice is probably the most suited crop to be growing in an arid climate like ours, because the simple fact is, if we have a drought here, or if there's very limited water in the dams, we don't grow it. We just sit back and we have to buy our time. But if there's plenty of water in the dams, we grow rice. And when we do grow rice, we're the most efficient rice growers in the world. We create a whole that crop itself, as you said, the southern bullfrog, which is an endangered species, the bittern, like there's numerous amount of endangered species that actually breed on our farms now, because we actually are growing. It's like a wetland. You can see the trees in the background.
Yeah.
Most Aussie farmers are pretty good at that. That we live in this environment, so we appreciate it. So we don't go and clear fell the whole thing. We work with it. We've created a whole new lot of biodiversity that actually revolves around our irrigation practices. And now that we're actually dewatering these places, that whole biodiversity is just collapsing.
Yeah.
Because we keep our creeks and gullies and other things going, and quite a number of us actually also have our own private wetlands that we actually do use specifically as that, forgetting even about the rice crops. But the rice crops are something that when there's plenty of water around, we grow it. It provides an enormous amount of revenue for the Australian GDP, and at the end of it, we actually have people living on the inland, which is important to actually move them away from the coast.
And as you say, if it was an orchard of some sort, other types of crops that are permanent plantings, they have to put water on it every year, even in a drought. But being an annual crop like this, you can make that decision based on how much water is available. Now, there has been some coverage recently, and I applaud the ABC Rural for this, and this is, I believe, Cara Jeffrey's article here talking about the impact on these particular farmers, but this is really replicated for yourself and for so many people, sitting there saying, well, is it really worth it? And sitting there saying, well, you've busted your guts for how many decades doing this, and I'm sure by now, John, you must be feeling incredibly unappreciated and incredibly, I wouldn't blame you for being a little bit bitter towards city people like myself for being so taken for granted. What can be done to improve this situation? We have a Murray Darling Basin plan that, in my opinion, has been a disaster since the start. We have a federal government that is determined to ram through all the last of it, all the last 450 gigalitres of water, buybacks, etc. There's been an enormous amount of damage already. There is more damage coming thanks to this decision by Tanya Plibersek. What can be done about this? How can we help?
Look, the bottom line is this is the final kick in the guts for most of us because, as you can see, I'm an old fart and there's quite a few of us that have, battled on, and we have actually got a fair few younger people that started coming back onto farms. But the only way they're going to survive is with access to water so that we can actually have our irrigated crops. Like we've just finished harvesting some of our cereals. We had like our dryland crops. It was actually quite a good year. We harvested sort of 3 and 4 ton dryland crops. Yeah, but our irrigated crops, we were harvesting 8 and 9 ton cereal crops, and that's because of irrigation. Now, if we haven't got that, that's what makes the wheels turn. So to give our next generation an opportunity to be able to keep farming, they need access to water. And people like myself that are, I've been around for a fair while. I do own water entitlements. And what Plibersek's doing, she's targeting the older generation. She's targeting the water traders, the water punters, to actually buy water off them. Now, that's all good and well for the individual. For me, it'd be terrific. If all I cared about was myself and my wife, we could sell our water, make a lot of good money out of it, and we could head off into the sunset. But the problem is the water that I've got here belongs to this community. It belongs to the area where it comes from because the infrastructure's there. The towns that are around our area, that me spending money in town, whether it's fertiliser, fuel, going to the grocery store, all of those things revolve around us spending $1. And if I sell my water, every megalitre that I sell takes away from the productive pool. And the only place these younger blokes can buy that, not only younger blokes, but new people that have come into the area, the only place they can get that water from is out of the productive pool. And as Tanya Plibersek and previous governments keep on reducing that productive pool smaller and smaller, it pushes the price up. There's a Victorian report that was done last year that proved that as that water, the productive pool reduces, it pushes the price of water up higher and higher to unsustainable levels. And you touched on it before that, we've got crops downstream that they're at annual crops. They need water every year. That is not suitable for the Australian climate. The Australian climate needs annuals like rice because we can go, 1 year not grow rice, next 2 years we grow it. But if you're going to put an almond plantation in, you need to water that crop every year.
Yeah.
And government policy has not taken that into consideration. The amount of development that has taken hold in the last probably 4 to 5 years downstream of what we call the Barmah Choke or downstream of Swan Hill physically cannot get the volumes of water there that's required. And now Tanya Plibersek with her 450, the extra water she's trying to get out of production and the extra water that she says is for, to return to the rivers, the river can't sustain the volumes of water that are already going down it. That's why we see the banks of the rivers eroding, trees collapsing into the river. It is not a Nile or a Ganges. The Murray River is at relatively a small channel in comparison to world's rivers around the world. You start trying to pump too much water down there, and you'll see exactly what's happening at the moment. Those rivers are collapsing. With the erosion on the banks, the loss of trees right through the forest, right through to the other side of Swan Hill, and all for what? So we can push more water out to sea?
Well, again,
it just doesn't make sense.
Just to paint the picture for people who are city-based, the Murray River, it is a very small channel, as you've said, but in a boom and bust environment where the boom means a flood that goes over the top and the channel's irrelevant, and a bust means there's hardly anything in there, and again, the channel's irrelevant, that's fine. But then you end up in a situation like what we have now, as you say, where we're just running that thing at capacity the whole time, and it is causing huge erosion issues. Look, John, I can see you've got some other commitments there. I'm going to let you go. Thank you so much for joining us here on the Aussie Wire.
Yeah, no worries at all. And thanks for taking an interest in it too, Topher. It's really important that the urban public actually gets a little bit of a feel of what actually is happening out here, because they're the ones that will pay the consequences at the end of the day. Because it's it's all about food at the right prices, clean, green. We do what we do exceptionally well. We're the best rice growers in the world. We're the best at most things that we do. And you take water out of these environments, and you'll end up back to what we had originally, which was dry, arid areas where you run 10 sheep to the acre. Yeah. And it's not good for the future of Australia.
And I tell you, here's a pro tip for everybody watching. If you want to deal with the cost of living crisis and bring the cost of food down, give our farmers water. It's that simple. John, thank you so much. Thank you for watching the Aussie Wire News. We have a series of special episodes coming up next week. Now, new episodes are always released at 4 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday, and the specials are no exception. You can catch up on past episodes at theaussiewire.com, and make sure you join our email list and check out our blog while you're there. And please consider becoming an insider. That's a financial supporter of the Aussie Wire. The link is in the description. I'm Topher Field, and this is the Aussie Wire.